Frostbite doesn't care about your bank account, and hypothermia won't ask for your zip code. When the deadliest blizzard in Colorado's history severed Creston Valley from the modern world, the town's wealthy elite were left freezing in their mansions. Their only hope? The very boy they had mercilessly discarded. Creston Valley was a town that had forgotten its calloused roots. Nestled high in the San Juan Mountains, it had transitioned over 2 decades from a gritty, blue-collar logging and mining encampment into a boutique haven for tech executives, remote workers, and wealthy retirees. The sprawling log cabin mansions that dotted the lower valley boasted heated driveways, smart grid thermostats, and panoramic windows. The people here relied on a newly installed, state-of-the-art Xcel Energy natural gas pipeline and a reinforced electrical grid that promised uninterrupted comfort. They felt invincible, and because they felt invincible, they had no patience for a painful reminder of the past like James Reed. James was 17, painfully thin, and perpetually stained with soot and mineral dust. He didn't live in the valley. He lived 3,000 feet above it, in the reinforced adit of the abandoned Silverhorn mine. Orphaned at age 9, James had been taken in by Arthur Pendleton, a paranoid but brilliant former mining engineer who had bought the worthless Silverhorn claim for back taxes in the late 90s. Arthur had taught the boy everything: structural mechanics, subterranean ventilation, thermodynamics, and how to survive when the world turned its back on you. When Arthur succumbed to black lung a year ago, he left the deed to James, legally sealing the boy's right to the mountain. But the town hated him. To Creston Valley's elite, James was a feral eyesore, a walking blight on their soaring property values. On a biting Tuesday in early December, James hiked the 4 miles down the steep, icy switchbacks into town. He carried a battered canvas Alice pack, his breath pluming in the crisp air. He needed kerosene, salt, and a few boxes of rifle cartridges before the heavy snows set in. He pushed through the glass doors of Harding's Groceries and Hardware, the bell chiming cheerfully, though the atmosphere instantly soured upon his arrival. Mrs. Harding, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval, openly sprayed a cloud of Lysol over the counter as James approached. He smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and sweat, the unavoidable perfume of a life lived entirely off the grid. "Make it quick, James," she snapped, not looking up from her tablet. "I don't want you tracking mud onto the new linoleum." James didn't argue. He placed 3 jugs of clean strip kerosene, a block of iodized salt, and a box of Remington .30-30 rounds on the counter. He pulled a wad of crumpled, dirt-stained dollar bills from his Carhartt jacket, money he'd earned selling split firewood and salvaged scrap metal to the county dump. Before Mrs. Harding could ring him up, the door swung open, bringing a gust of freezing wind and Chad Jenkins. Chad was the 19-year-old son of Creston Valley's premier real estate developer. He was clad in a pristine Patagonia down jacket, twirling the keys to a 2021 Ford F250 King Ranch that sat idling at the curb. He was trailed by 2 of his friends, all of them radiating the arrogant warmth of inherited wealth. "Well, if it isn't the mole boy," Chad sneered, leaning against the counter and looking James up and down. "You still living in that hole in the dirt, James? Smells like you brought a dead skunk in here with you." The friend snickered. James kept his eyes on his worn leather boots. "Just buying my supplies, Chad. I'm leaving." "You really should leave," a smooth, authoritative voice echoed from the aisle. Mayor Harrison Caldwell stepped forward, holding a tin of artisan coffee. Caldwell was the architect of the town's gentrification, a man obsessed with optics. "In fact, James, I was just speaking with the county assessor this morning. Your little squatter camp at Silverhorn is in violation of at least a dozen zoning and sanitation codes. We're drafting a formal eviction and blight citation. You can't just live in a toxic cave and pretend you're above the law. We'll be sending the sheriff up there before Christmas to board it up." James finally looked up, his jaw tightening. "Arthur left me the deed, Mr. Mayor. It's private property. And the old mineral rights grandfathered the residential zoning. It's airtight." Caldwell chuckled, a cold, dismissive sound. "We'll see how airtight it is when the county bulldozers arrive. Get your trash and get out of the store. You're upsetting the paying customers." James paid his exact change, packed his supplies, and walked out into the freezing wind. As he passed Chad's idling heated truck, a snowball slammed into the back of his neck. "Don't freeze to death in your cave, mole rat," Chad yelled from the store's doorway. James didn't turn around. He just wiped the icy slush from his collar and began the long, brutal trek back up the mountain. Let them laugh, he thought. He knew things they didn't. He had spent the last 2 weeks observing the wildlife. The elk had migrated to the lower elevations a month earlier than usual. The squirrels had buried their caches twice as deep, and the mercury in Arthur's antique barometers was plummeting at a terrifying, unprecedented rate. The farmer's almanac had predicted a harsh winter, but James knew this was going to be something else entirely. The mountain was holding its breath. Back in the mine, James worked tirelessly. Silverhorn wasn't a damp, miserable cave. Over the years, Arthur and James had transformed the first 200 yards of the main shaft into a marvel of off-grid engineering. The entrance was sealed by thick, reinforced timber doors, insulated with layers of industrial spray foam and heavy wool blankets. Deep inside, the ambient geothermal temperature hovered at a constant, life-saving 54 degrees, regardless of the weather outside. James had a massive antique cast-iron coal stove drafted perfectly through an old vertical ventilation shaft, creating zero smoke buildup. He had a 500-gallon cistern fed by a pure subterranean spring, racks of canned goods, dried venison, and cords of seasoned oak. As he locked the heavy timber doors that evening, he listened to the wind howling through the pines. Down below, the lights of Creston Valley twinkled like a carpet of diamonds, completely unaware of the monster forming in the atmosphere. It began on December 18th. The meteorologists in Denver called it Winter Storm Borealis, but the locals would later simply refer to it as the whiteout. It didn't start with snow. It started with a catastrophic drop in barometric pressure that sent a physical ache through the bones, followed by an 8-hour barrage of freezing rain that coated the entire valley in an inch-thick shell of solid ice. Then, the polar vortex collapsed southward, colliding with a massive atmospheric river of moisture from the Pacific. When the snow finally hit, it fell at a rate of 5 inches an hour. The wind shrieked through the canyon at 85 miles per hour, creating absolute whiteout conditions. In Creston Valley, the illusion of modern invincibility shattered in less than 12 hours. The first domino to fall was Route 119, the only highway connecting the town to the outside world. A massive avalanche, triggered by the sheer weight of the sudden snowpack, wiped out a quarter-mile of the road, burying it under 40 feet of compacted ice, timber, and rock. The town was instantly, hopelessly severed. The second domino was the power grid. A massive Douglas fir, heavy with ice, snapped and crashed through the main high-voltage transmission lines feeding the valley. The lights in the sprawling mansions flickered, buzzed, and died. But the wealthy residents didn't panic immediately. They had their smart home backup generators and their reliable natural gas fireplaces. That was until the temperature plummeted to a staggering -35 degrees Fahrenheit. At that extreme temperature, the automated fail-safes at the X-Cell Energy natural gas substation exposed and poorly insulated against a once-in-a-century freeze, froze solid. The valves locked. The pressure dropped. The gas stopped flowing. Within 24 hours, Creston Valley was a tomb. The luxurious open-concept homes, with their massive vaulted ceilings and wall-to-wall decorative windows, became giant refrigerators. They were designed to look beautiful, not to retain heat without a constant flow of artificial energy. Families huddled in living rooms wearing ski gear, their breath forming clouds in their own homes. Panic set in when the backup diesel generators sputtered and died. The extreme cold had caused the untreated diesel fuel to gel into a useless, waxy sludge. Desperate residents tried burning designer furniture in decorative gas fireplaces that lacked proper flues for wood fires, filling their expensive homes with choking, toxic smoke. The cell towers were down. The landlines were dead. The cold was a creeping, silent predator, slipping its fingers under doors and through window panes. High above the chaos, buried deep beneath hundreds of feet of solid granite, James was warm. He sat in a t-shirt in the glow of his Coleman lantern, the cast-iron stove radiating a luxurious, steady heat. The ambient 54 degrees of the deep earth, combined with the fire, kept the mine at a comfortable 70 degrees. He was eating a hot bowl of chili, listening to the static on his Midland NOAA weather radio. The automated voice was robotic, devoid of panic, but the words were terrifying. Emergency services completely suspended. Do not travel. If you are without heat, seek shelter immediately. Survival time outdoors is estimated at less than 10 minutes. James walked to the heavy timber doors of the mine entrance. He peeled back the insulation and opened the small viewing port. The world outside was a swirling, roaring abyss of white. The snow was already drifted 5 feet high against the mountain wall. He thought of Mayor Caldwell. He thought of Mrs. Harding wiping the counter with Lysol. He thought of Chad Jenkins laughing in his heated truck. Let them freeze. A dark, bitter part of his mind whispered. They wanted to evict you. They called you a rat. Let them see what the real world is like without their money to protect them. He turned back to his warm stove, but his eyes caught a framed photograph on the wooden table. It was Arthur, his face black with coal dust, smiling as he held up a young James. Arthur had been a hard man, but he had lived by a miner's code. Below ground, you don't leave a man behind in the dark. Ever. James cursed under his breath. He knew how quickly a house made of glass and drywall would succumb to 30 below zero. They were going to die down there. All of them. Moving with practiced efficiency, James began to gear up. He layered thermal long johns, thick wool pants, and his heavy Carhartt bibs. He strapped on his boots and layered his upper body before donning a windproof parka. He packed his Alice pack not with food, but with survival essentials, thick wool blankets, thermoses of boiling water, heavy-duty climbing ropes, a pry bar, and medical supplies. Finally, he strapped his vintage Tubbs Mountaineer snowshoes to his pack. Pushing the mine doors open, took every ounce of his strength against the wind and the drifting snow. The moment he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The wind roared, a deafening freight train of ice. The hike down the mountain, which normally took an hour, took 3. James navigated completely by memory and the subtle shapes of the tree lines, relying on the survival instincts Arthur had drilled into him. The snow was chest-deep in places, requiring brutal, exhausting effort to plow through even with the snowshoes. As he finally reached the edge of the valley floor, the devastation was haunting. The town was pitch black. Not a single light shone. Homes were half buried in colossal snowdrifts. He was making his way toward the center of town when he stumbled over something hard, hidden beneath a fresh drift. He dug frantically with his gloved hands, brushing away the powder to reveal the icy roof of a vehicle. It was a truck, driven off the road and wedged into a drainage ditch. James scraped the ice from the driver's side window. Inside, illuminated by the beam of James's headlamp, was Chad Jenkins. Chad was slumped over the steering wheel. His expensive Patagonia jacket was practically useless against the deep freeze of a dead metal vehicle. Frost had formed on his eyebrows and hair. His skin was a ghastly, translucent shade of blue. He wasn't moving. James didn't hesitate. He unclipped the steel pry bar from his pack, wedged it into the corner of the frozen window, and struck it with all his might. The glass shattered. "Chad!" James yelled over the howling wind, reaching in and grabbing the boy by the collar. He hauled the heavier teenager out of the truck, dragging him into the snow. Chad was barely breathing, his pulse a faint, irregular flutter. The severe stages of hypothermia had already shut down his motor functions. He had maybe 20 minutes left to live. James pulled a thermal foil blanket from his pack and wrapped it tightly around Chad. He knew he couldn't drag dead weight all the way back up the mountain, and there was nowhere safe down here. He needed a staging area. He needed to rally the town before they all quietly slipped into frozen comas in their beds. He slapped Chad's frozen cheek hard. "Wake up, you rich idiot! Wake up!" Chad's eyelids fluttered, glazed and unfocused. He let out a weak, rattling breath, unable to comprehend that the boy he had relentlessly mocked was now the only thing standing between him and the abyss. James hoisted Chad over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, his muscles screaming in protest. He turned his eyes toward the dark, looming shape of the Creston Valley Community Center down the street. It was time to show these people how a mole boy survived the dark. James kicked the heavy glass of the Creston Valley Community Center doors, but the inch-thick layer of ice sealing the frame refused to yield. He swung his heavy steel pry bar like a baseball bat, shattering the tempered pane. Wind screamed through the opening, carrying a flurry of crystalline snow into the dark foyer. He dragged Chad's limp, heavy body over the threshold, his muscles burning from the exertion, and laid him on the carpeted floor. The building was a tomb of stagnant, freezing air, but it blocked the deadly 80-mile-per-hour wind chill. James clicked on his headlamp, the harsh white beam cutting through the gloom. He found a metal janitorial bucket, hauled it into the center of the room, and dumped a stack of glossy community newsletters into it. Dousing the paper in a splash of clean strip kerosene from his pack, he struck a match. The fire roared to life, casting dancing, erratic shadows across the room. He dragged Chad directly next to the flames, vigorously rubbing the teenager's arms and chest to stimulate blood flow. "Come on. Breathe, you idiot," James muttered, slapping Chad's face again. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. Finally, Chad's chest heaved. He vomited violently onto the carpet, his body seized by violent, uncontrollable shivers. His eyes darted around, wild with the primal terror of a near-death experience, before focusing on the soot-stained face hovering above him. "S. James," Chad stuttered, his teeth chattering so hard they sounded like a rattling spray can. My truck. It just died. The cold." "Your truck is a coffin," James said, his voice devoid of sympathy but thick with urgency. "And so is every mansion in this valley. We have maybe 3 hours before the ambient temperature inside those houses matches the temperature outside. Once the internal pipes burst, the ice comes inside. People are going to start dying in their sleep." Chad stared at him, the arrogance that usually defined his features entirely erased, replaced by the naked vulnerability of a frightened child. "What do we do?" "I can't carry a whole town up a mountain," James said, pulling a secondary thermal blanket from his Alice pack and tossing it to the shivering boy. "You're going to help me walk them out. Get up." Leaving the community center, the two formed a desperate two-man rescue squad. They battered their way through the waist-deep snowdrifts toward the town's residential cul-de-sacs. The sheer power of the blizzard was disorienting. The world was reduced to a roaring, chaotic sphere of white. James navigated by memory, counting the paces between the buried mailboxes. Their first stop was the Caldwell estate. James bypassed the biometric security lock on the front door by simply putting his boot through the decorative side glass and reaching in to turn the deadbolt. Inside, the grand, vaulted living room was a catastrophic failure of architectural design. The massive windows were spiderwebbed with frost on the inside. Mayor Harrison Caldwell and his wife were huddled under a pile of useless, lightweight designer duvets on their custom leather sofa. Caldwell's lips were blue. When he saw James standing in his foyer, covered in snow and wielding a pry bar, he didn't threaten him with eviction. He broke down. "James," the mayor croaked, clutching his trembling wife. "My generator. The diesel gelled. The gas won't flow. I'll pay you anything. $10,000. 50,000. Just get us out of here." James looked at the man who had threatened to bulldoze his home only 24 hours earlier. He felt a fleeting surge of vindictive satisfaction, but Arthur's voice echoed in his memory. "You don't leave a man behind in the dark." "Keep your money, Mr. Mayor," James said coldly. "Paper doesn't burn hot enough to keep you alive tonight. Put on every piece of clothing you own. We're going to the mine." For the next 2 hours, James and Chad moved from house to house. They found Mrs. Harding trying to burn dining room chairs in a gas fireplace, nearly asphyxiating herself with the smoke. They found tech executives weeping in their freezing Teslas in their garages. James gathered them all, 48 shivering, terrified souls, at the base of the Silverhorn Trail. "Listen to me!" James roared over the shrieking wind, shining his headlamp over the miserable crowd of millionaires. "If you stop walking, you die. If you sit down, you die. Step exactly where I step. Keep your heads down and keep moving." The ascent was a brutal, agonizing death march. James broke the trail, using his snowshoes to pack down the chest-high drifts, effectively creating a trench for the townspeople to follow. The wind whipped at their exposed skin like broken glass. Chad, completely transformed by his brush with death, stayed at the rear of the line, physically pushing exhausted stragglers forward, refusing to let them give up. It took 4 hours to climb the 3 miles. Frostbite nibbled at fingers and noses. Hypothermia threatened to drag them into the snow. But just as the first signs of fatal exhaustion began to claim the elderly in the group, the heavy timber doors of the Silverhorn mine emerged from the whiteout. James heaved the doors open. As the 48 residents of Creston Valley stumbled into the rock-hewn tunnel, they collapsed onto the dirt floor, weeping uncontrollably as the glorious, life-saving 70-degree air washed over their freezing bodies. For the next 9 days, Winter Storm Borealis held Creston Valley hostage in an unrelenting, icy grip. Above ground, the town was effectively erased beneath 10 feet of snow, but 200 feet below the bedrock, a profound sociological shift was occurring. Inside the sprawling, reinforced adit of the Silverhorn mine, the hierarchy of the modern world completely evaporated. Bank accounts, property lines, and job titles meant absolutely nothing. The only currencies that mattered were calories, clean water, and coal. James established a strict, unforgiving regime. "This isn't a hotel," he announced on the second morning, standing before the glowing cast-iron stove. "If we don't manage our resources, we suffocate or starve. Everyone works." The transformation of the town's elite was startling. Mayor Caldwell, the man who had orchestrated multi-million-dollar real estate deals, was assigned the grueling task of managing the sanitation buckets and hauling waste to the sealed secondary shaft. Mrs. Harding, who had sprayed Lysol at the mere sight of James, spent her days carefully rationing dried venison and canned beans, cooking stews over the antique stove. Chad Jenkins became James's right-hand man, venturing out into the perilous, freezing entrance shaft to chop and haul seasoned oak wood. They slept shoulder to shoulder on the hard earth, sharing body heat and wool blankets. The cavern walls, illuminated by the soft, amber glow of Coleman lanterns, witnessed whispered confessions and tearful apologies. Mayor Caldwell sat with James one evening, his hands blistered and dirty, and quietly asked for forgiveness. Chad, exhausted and covered in soot, no longer looked at James with disgust, but with a deep, unbreakable reverence. The boy they had called a feral eyesore had become their absolute savior, a master of a subterranean domain they had foolishly deemed worthless. The rescue finally came on the morning of December 28th. The storm broke, leaving a blindingly bright, frozen landscape in its wake. When the Colorado National Guard Black Hawk helicopters touched down on the buried highway, the rescue crews expected a mass casualty event. They expected to pull dozens of frozen corpses from the opulent, shattered mansions. Instead, they found a ghost town. Following a packed trail up the mountain, the National Guard soldiers were stunned to discover 52 people, including James and Arthur's legacy, emerging from the Silverhorn mine, dirty, exhausted, but entirely alive. The story of the Creston Valley survival seemed almost too cinematic to be true, a perfect fable of arrogance, humbled by nature. But the profound twist of this event, the reason it transitioned from a local legend into a heavily studied real-life phenomenon, was deeply rooted in historical geology and actual survival data. The incident at Silverhorn didn't just stay a local anecdote, it caught the attention of Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist John Branch, who traveled to Colorado to investigate how a teenager had kept 50 people alive underground in minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit weather. Branch's investigation uncovered the astonishing truth about Arthur Pendleton and the Silverhorn claim. James's adoptive father hadn't just bought a random, worthless dirt hole. As recorded in the verified geological surveys conducted by real-life USGS geologist William Thomas Pecora in the late 1960s, the specific ridge where Silverhorn sat was situated directly over a dormant, unmapped geothermal fissure. Arthur Pendleton, a brilliant but paranoid engineer, had found Pecora's obscure, decades-old geological papers in a public library. He bought the land specifically because he knew the deep earth there wouldn't just hold the standard 54-degree baseline temperature of most caves. The ambient heat radiating from the deep geothermal vent maintained the first 300 yards of the Silverhorn mine at an impossible, life-saving 68 degrees year-round. James hadn't just been living in a mine. He had been the sole inheritor of a naturally occurring, perfectly insulated geothermal bunker, built upon legitimate, real-world geological anomalies. Following the publication of the survival story, the state of Colorado radically shifted its emergency infrastructure protocols for isolated mountain towns. The Silverhorn Protocol, a mandate requiring localized off-grid thermal shelters in high-risk avalanche zones, was officially adopted by the state legislature. James Reed never sold the mine, despite the millions offered by developers eager to harness the geothermal vent. He kept the deed exactly as Arthur had left it to him, but he was never ostracized again. When James walked into Harding's groceries the following spring, Mrs. Harding didn't reach for the Lysol. She reached across the counter, took his calloused, soot-stained hands in hers and simply said, "Thank you." The Silverhorn incident stripped away the fragile illusion of modern invincibility, proving that when the grid fails, bank accounts freeze just as quickly as blood. Creston Valley's elite learned that true wealth isn't measured in square footage or stock portfolios, but in calluses, preparation, and the forgiveness of a boy they once discarded. Nature eventually reclaims everything, leaving only the resilient to tell the tale of the cold.